At 2:38 a.m. on January 17, 1991, a UN coalition of 34 countries led by the United States launched Operation Desert Storm, a military campaign aimed at expelling the forces of Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. The operation opens with a massive aerial bombardment campaign with over 2,000 aircraft flying round-the-clock missions deep into occupied Kuwait and Iraq itself. Over the next 43 days, coalition aircraft flew a staggering 109,876 sorties, dropping 88,500 tons of ordnance on Iraqi military and civilian infrastructure. In a masterfully coordinated series of strikes, F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighters dropped laser-guided weapons on communication centers, while Tomahawk cruise missiles targeted power stations and command bunkers. Apache helicopters attacked and destroyed radar installations, and B-52 Stratofortress bombers carpet-bombed Iraqi positions. The effect was devastating. Within hours, the Iraqi Air Force had been all but annihilated, and vast swaths of Iraqi troops had fled in terror, allowing coalition aircraft to achieve total air superiority over Kuwait and Iraq and press home attacks against Iraqi positions. Under this onslaught, the Iraqi forces crumbled. When the ground campaign, Operation Desert Sabre, began 38 days later, it took only 100 hours to expel the invaders from Kuwait. The Desert Storm air campaign was one of the most effective and decisive military operations in modern history, a textbook demonstration of the devastating power of aerial warfare. But while today air power forms the cornerstone of nearly every military force on Earth, this was not always the case. For despite we humans' rather persistent habit of turning any new technology into some sort of weapon, or to use it in pornography, in the early days of aviation, military planners were slow to recognize the extraordinary potential of the airplane, seeing it as little more than a useless novelty. Then, on November 1st, 1911, a lone pilot climbed into a primitive fabric-covered monoplane and set off over the North African desert on a mission that would forever change the face of modern warfare. This is the story of history's first bombardment by aeroplane. As covered in our previous video, the Aerostatic Company, the world's first military air force, military aviation actually predates the invention of the aeroplane by over 100 years, with the first military balloons appearing on the battlefield in 1794 during the War of the First Coalition between revolutionary France and the kingdoms of Europe. Over the following century, military balloons would be used almost exclusively as observation platforms for spotting enemy troop movements and directing artillery fire, with one notable exception. During the Italian War for Independence in 1849, Austria carried out the world's first recorded aerial attack, launching a flotilla of unmanned hot air balloons carrying timed explosives against the city of Venice. Unfortunately, in a classic example of Murphy's Law, in action, the initially favorable wind suddenly turned, pushing the swarm of balloons back towards the Austrian lines. Thankfully, minimal damage was inflicted on either side, but while no further balloon-based attacks would be attempted for the remainder of the century, the spectre of aerial bombardment weighed heavily on the minds of military planners around the world, who saw this new form of warfare as a dastardly underhanded affront to the gentlemanly rules of war. So strong was this aversion that Article 4 of the First Hague Convention on the Laws of War, signed on July 29, 1899, prohibited, for a term of 5 years, the launching of projectiles and explosives from balloons or by other new methods of a similar nature. While the clause, other new methods of a similar nature, should theoretically have also prohibited the use of heavier-than-air aircraft for offensive purposes, if history has taught us anything, it is that governments and militaries can be highly creative in their interpretation of the rules when doing so allows them to gain an advantage over their enemies. But it would take another decade for the advantages of military aviation to be recognized and exploited on the battlefield. While the development of air power is typically associated with the Great War of 1914 to 1918, the aeroplane's baptism of fire would actually come a few years earlier in a conflict that's largely forgotten today. The birth of the aeroplane was an inauspicious one. The first controlled, powered, heavy-than-air flight performed by the Wright brothers flyer on December 17th, 1903, lasted all of 12 seconds and covered a distance of 50 meters, less than the wingspan of a Boeing 747 airliner. Over the following decades, pioneering aviators would struggle to get airborne in fragile contraptions of wood, canvas, and wire that could be, and often were, knocked out of the air by a stiff breeze. Yet even at this early stage, inventors were already trying to market their their awkward new contraptions as potential weapons of war, with predictably lackluster results. On May 24, 1908, French aircraft designer Gabriel Vorset and pilot Léon Delegrand appeared in Rome to demonstrate their new Voisin No. 2 biplane in front of a crowd that included Italian Minister of War Severino Cassana. The demonstration was less than spectacular, with Delegrand only managing a few short hops at an altitude of 1 meter. The mood of the crowd quickly turned ugly, with police having to be called to prevent an angry mob from tearing the aircraft and its pilot to shreds. Unsurprisingly, Minister Cassana was unimpressed and opted not to buy Voisin's machine. But one man saw what many could not. Also in the crowd that day was 39-year-old Major Zulio Douhet, a career army officer and commander of the elite Bersaglieri unit, who had already written 2 books on the mechanization of warfare. When it came to the aeroplane, where most saw a useless plaything for eccentrics and a technology dead end, Douhet saw endless potential, writing of Voisin's 1908 demonstration flights. Since the airplane is already capable of rising a few feet, soon it will be able to rise thousands of feet and cover a distance of thousands of miles. From that day on, Douhet became a tireless advocate for the development of air power, first laying down his ideas in a newspaper article in which he prophetically argued, "To us, who have until now been inexorably bound to the surface of the earth, it must seem strange that the sky, too, is to become another battlefield, no less important than the battlefields on land and sea. For if there are nations that exist untouched by the sea, there are none that exist without the breath of air." Today, we are fully aware of the importance of having command of the seas. Soon, command of the air will be equally important, for the advantage of aerial observation and the ability to see targets clearly can be exploited only when the enemy is compelled to remain earthbound. The Army and Navy must recognize in the Air Force the birth of a third brother, younger, but none the less important in the great military family. These ideas were revolutionary, turning traditional military thinking on its head. Aircraft, Douhet argued, added a whole new dimension to warfare, allowing conventional ground forces to be bypassed entirely and strategic targets like rail lines and supply depots to be attacked deep behind enemy lines. If an enemy's air force and anti-aircraft defenses could be knocked out in a surprise attack, then the attacker would gain complete command of the air, allowing them to bombard the enemy with impunity and swiftly render them defenseless. These theories presaged the modern concept of air superiority, so dramatically epitomized by the opening air campaign of Operation Desert Storm in 1991. But there was also a darker side to Douhet's thinking, which would cast a long and brutal shadow over much of the 20th century. While conventional military thinking saw warfare as a contest between soldiers on the battlefield, Douhet recognized that a nation's ability to wage war was dependent not only on its armed forces, but also on its industrial capacity and the will of its civilian populace. And air power, Douhet argued, was the key to taking out those 2 vital pillars. By bombarding factories and cities from the air, aircraft could not only destroy a nation's ability to produce weapons and other war material, but also shatter its civilian morale, causing its entire war effort to collapse. Douhet even proposed a 3-part bombardment strategy to ensure maximum destruction. Conventional explosive bombs to break open buildings, followed by incendiary bombs to set them alight, and finally poison gas bombs to prevent emergency services from coming to the rescue. This strategy, known as strategic bombing to its advocates and terror bombing to its detractors, would prove highly influential, reaching its ultimate horrific crescendo during the Second World War, with the massive Allied firebombing campaigns against Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, and dozens of other Axis cities, campaigns that would result in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians. And for more on how these deadly bombardment methods were perfected, please check out our previous video on the curious case of the German and Japanese cities in America during World War II. Douhet was not alone in his musings on air power. In the same year as Gabriel Voisin's demonstration in Rome, British science fiction writer H.G. Wells published the novel War in the Air, which presented a bleak vision of aerial warfare. To quote, "There is no place where a woman and her daughters can hide and be at peace. The war comes through the air. Bombs drop in the night. Quiet people go out in the morning and see air fleets passing overhead, dripping death. blood-dripping death. Unfortunately, at the time, few military planners were as fascinated as Douhet and Wells, and despite his tireless lobbying, Douhet's ideas on air power were largely ignored by the Italian General Staff. Not that the military was completely uninterested in aviation, they had simply decided to place their faith in the then more advanced technology of dirigible airships rather than heavier-than-air craft. In 1910, however, the Italian army decided to purchase 9 German Etrich Taube aircraft on an experimental basis. One of the first military aircraft to be mass-produced, the Taube, or Dove, was an advanced design for its time, a monoplane with swept-back wingtips resembling a bird's. The timing of the acquisition was fortuitous. For the following year, Italy, in a bid to expand its overseas empire, declared war against the Ottoman Empire and launched an invasion of the North African province of Libya. Seeing an opportunity to test the aeroplane's mettle in combat, the Italian army dispatched its fledgling air flotilla to Tripoli. Thus it was that on October 23, 1911, Captain Carlo Piazza made history by flying the world's first military air patrol. Taking off at 6:19 a.m. from Tripoli, he flew south along the road to the Turkish stronghold of Azizia, returning an hour later with accurate reports of enemy troop movements. Like their balloon predecessors, military aircraft were at first relegated to observation and artillery spotting duties, but barely a week after Piazza's pioneering air patrol, fellow pilot Lieutenant Giulio Gavotti made history again by demonstrating the airplane's destructive potential. On November 1, 1911, Gavotti took off from Tripoli and flew east towards the small oasis of Ain Zara. Strapped to the inside of his cockpit were 4 large grenades, the first aerial bombs ever deployed aboard a heavier-than-air craft. In a letter to his father, Gavotti described what happened next. Today, 2 boxes full of bombs arrived. We are expected to throw them from our planes. It is very strange that none of us have been told about this and that we haven't received any instruction from our superiors. So we are taking the bombs on board with the greatest precaution. It will be very interesting to try them on the Turks. As soon as the weather is clear, I head to the camp to take my plane out. Near the seat, I've fixed a little leather case with padding inside. I've laid the bombs in it very carefully. These are small, round bombs, weighing about 1.5 kilos each. I put 3 in the case and another one in the front pocket of my jacket. After a while, I notice the dark shape of the oasis. With one hand, I hold the steering wheel. With the other, I take out one of the bombs and put it on my lap. I am ready. The oasis is about 1 kilometer away. I can see the Arab tents very well. I take the bomb with my right hand, pull off the security tag, and throw the bomb out, avoiding the wing. I can see it falling through the sky for a couple of seconds, and then it disappears. And after a little while, I can see a small dark cloud in the middle of the encampment. I've hit the target. I then send 2 other bombs with less success. I still have one left, which I decide to launch later on an oasis close to Tripoli. I came back really pleased with the result. I go straight to report to General Caneva. Everybody is satisfied. While Gavotti's bombardment caused little damage and inflicted no casualties, the psychological effects were undeniable. Turkish propaganda claimed that Gavotti's bombs had accidentally struck a field hospital, while several nations condemned the attack as a heinous breach of the laws of war, citing Article 4 of the 1899 Hague Convention. The Italians, in turn, pointed out that the article only bans the dropping of bombs from balloons and thus did not apply in this case, conveniently ignoring the other new methods of a similar nature cause. But whatever the legal or moral status of the attack, one thing was certain: warfare was never going to be the same again. The Italo-Turkish War, which ended in October 1912 with an Italian victory, would play host to several other aviation firsts. In early 1912, Captain Piazza brought a camera aloft, pioneering aerial reconnaissance photography, while later that year the Turks managed to shoot down an Italian aircraft with small arms fire, bringing the birth of aerial warfare full circle. Impressed by these results, after the war, the Italian army created an official aviation battalion under the command of Douhet. Shortly thereafter, Douhet wrote the Rules for the Use of the Airplane in War, one of the first manuals on air power doctrine. However, the Italian army still saw air power as an extension of the regular ground forces, best used for reconnaissance or bombing enemy positions, rather than a separate military force capable of winning a war all on its own. Frustrated by the General Staff's refusal to take his theories seriously, Douhet conspired with designer Gianni Caproni to secretly design and construct the Caproni CA-1, a heavy bomber capable of flying up to 550 kilometers and dropping nearly a metric ton of bombs. For the General Staff, such an insubordination was a bridge too far, and Douhet was summarily exiled from the Italian army. Meanwhile, another military aviation first took place across the Atlantic in the United States. On June 7, 1912, Lieutenant Roy Kirtland and Captain Charles Chandler took off from College Park, Maryland in a Wright Model B, the first aircraft ever produced by the American Army Air Services. As Kirtland banked the aircraft over the field at an altitude of 100 meters, Chandler opened fire with a Lewis-like machine gun strapped between his legs, aiming for a white cloth banner staked out on the ground below. It was the first time a machine gun had ever been fired from an aeroplane, and the results were impressive, with a full 12% of Chandler's 47 rounds finding their target. The final ingredients of modern air power had arrived. And for more on the unique challenges of fitting guns to aircraft and how they were solved, please check out our previous video, How Did World War I Pilots Shoot Through Their Aircraft's Propeller? Yet despite these developments, militaries around the world were still slow to recognize the potential of military aviation, with W.K. McClure, a Times of London reporter embedded with the Italian army, reporting in 1911, "Bomb dropping, whether from airship or aeroplane, does not appear to have been attended by any great measure of success, and it is not unlikely that the possibilities of early development in this direction have been overrated." Thus, when the Great War broke out in August 1914, few nations had any sort of effective air force, and those that did used their aircraft largely for the traditional roles of reconnaissance and artillery spotting. The dubious honor of dropping the first bombs of the war would not go to an airplane, but the German Zeppelin Z6, which on August 5, 1914, bombarded the Belgian city of Liege. It was the first time aerial bombs had been dropped on a civilian rather than a military target. The Germans would invest heavily in airship developments during the war, using dozens of the giant craft to launch bombing raids against European cities such as Warsaw, Paris, and London. But Zeppelins ultimately proved a technological dead end, being expensive, cumbersome, difficult to navigate, dangerous to fly in bad weather, and especially following the development of incendiary bullets and other specialized weapons, increasingly vulnerable to enemy defenses. Far more practical were heavy bomber aircraft like the German Gotha G5 and British Handley Paged V-1500, which were faster, more maneuverable, more accurate, and far cheaper to build than the lumbering Zeppelins. By the time the Great War ended on November 11, 1918, the airplane had evolved from a flimsy wooden canvas contraption into a reliable and effective weapon of war, eclipsing the airship as the preferred instrument of air power. But while the war had vindicated many of Douhet's theories, the prophet of air power would have little direct involvement in its future development. Despite his exile during the war, Douhet continued to be a thorn in the Italian General Staff's side, lambasting them for their leadership in the disastrous campaign against Austria-Hungary and pushing for the construction of a massive heavy bomber fleet to break the bloody stalemate. For his trouble, Douhet was court-martialed and imprisoned for 1 year, but he continued to theorize and write from his prison cell, penning a treatise on strategic bombing titled The Command of the Air, and a novel, The War of 1901, about a fictional war between Germany and a Franco-Belgian alliance, which Germany handily wins by, what else, bombing its enemies' cities to smithereens. Exonerated of all charges in 1920, Douhet was promoted to general officer the following year and retired from the military soon after. He continued to write extensively about aerial strategy for another decade, dying in Rome in 1930 at the age of 60. But Douhet's ideas would live on, attracting many devoted apostles, including Hugh Trenchard and Arthur Bomber Harris in the UK, Hans von Siegt and Erhard Milch in Germany, Nikolai Zhukovsky and Andrei Tupolev in the Soviet Union, and Billy Mitchell in the United States. Like Douhet, these men believed that air power was the key to swift, decisive victory, and over the following decades would build their respective nations' fledgling air forces into formidable armadas, capable of obliterating hundreds of city blocks and tens of thousands of civilians in a single raid. In a horrifying twist of logic, the architects of air power believed strategic bombing to be the most humane form of warfare possible. For as the theory went, once exposed to the terror and destruction of aerial bombing, an enemy's civilian population would quickly lose the will to fight, rise up against their government, and sue for peace, resulting in a swift victory with minimal casualties. It was even thought that the fear of aerial bombardment would make war unthinkable, ensuring everlasting peace. But as the Allied powers were to discover during the Second World War, there was one tiny flaw with this theory. It simply wasn't true. No matter how many city blocks Allied bombers flattened or enemy civilians they incinerated, neither Germany nor Japan ever came close to overthrowing their own government during the war. Ironically, strategic bombing had just the opposite effect, actually strengthening the enemy's will to fight on. It was a lesson learned at a terrible cost, with more than 2 million civilians on all sides perishing in strategic bombing raids. In the end, the best use for military aircraft turned out to be tactical, flying missions in support of conventional ground forces, just as the Italians had done all the way back in 1911. So as we tune into the news and witness the awesome spectacle of jet fighters and drones dropping precision laser-guided munitions on individual targets from thousands of meters up, it is intriguing to consider that it all started with a single pilot in a rickety kite dropping hand grenades onto the desert below.